You ever wonder why some relationships feel like this magnetic pull? Like two people are drawn together in a way that's almost inexplicable, and yet, the moment they get close, the whole thing starts to fall apart. One person's pulling, the other's backing away. One is constantly asking for more, while the other feels suffocated and retreats. That's not just bad luck or timing, that's a pattern. And one of the most common patterns we see is the dynamic between avoidant and anxious attachment styles. On the surface, it might look like these two people are completely mismatched. One person wants connection, closeness, reassurance. The other values independence, space, emotional distance. You'd think these people wouldn't last 5 minutes together, but somehow they often do. Not only do they end up together, but they become obsessed with each other, locked in this emotional loop that neither of them can seem to break. And the reason for that goes deeper than just surface attraction. There's a very specific reason this happens. It's not just about what they want, it's about what they lack. The avoidant and the anxious types are drawn to each other's emotional gaps. It's less about compatibility and more about what they subconsciously recognize in the other person that fits the missing puzzle piece inside themselves. The anxious person craves connection. They want to feel seen, loved, prioritized. But deep down, there's often a fear that they're not enough, that love has to be earned, chased, or proven. And so when they meet someone who is emotionally unavailable, who doesn't offer their affection easily, it validates this core fear. It confirms the belief that love is something they have to work for. And so they double down. They give more, they try harder, they lean in. Now the avoidant, on the other hand, isn't looking for that same intensity. They value space. Emotional closeness often triggers feelings of vulnerability they haven't yet made peace with. Intimacy might make them feel exposed, overwhelmed, or even unsafe. So when someone gets too close, they back off. Not necessarily because they don't care, but because the closeness brings up feelings they don't know how to handle. But here's the twist. They're drawn to the anxious type because the anxious person does all the emotional heavy lifting. The anxious partner pursues, initiates, connects. And at first that feels flattering, even safe, because the avoidant can stay a step back while still receiving love. But eventually, the pressure of the anxious partner's emotional needs becomes too much, and they start to pull away. And that triggers the anxious person's biggest fear, that they're losing love, that they're being rejected. So they pursue harder, the avoidant retreats further, and the cycle repeats. This push-pull dynamic creates intensity. It creates drama. It creates this constant sense of tension that many people confuse with passion. They say, "I've never felt this strongly about anyone before," not realizing what they're actually feeling is not love. It's anxiety, fear, and validation of unresolved wounds. Because when someone is meeting your emotional needs, but inconsistently, your brain doesn't feel safe, it feels addicted. It's the uncertainty that keeps people hooked. And the anxious partner, who equates closeness with safety, will interpret that uncertainty as a sign to work harder. They think, if I just love more, if I just become more understanding, they'll finally come close. And the avoidant thinks, if I keep my distance, I can protect myself and still get the benefits of the relationship. Both people are acting out emotional blueprints they didn't consciously choose. They're reacting to each other in ways that feel instinctive, but those instincts were shaped by years of experience, often from early relationships, upbringing, or trauma. And what makes this dynamic so dangerous is how self-reinforcing it is. The more the anxious person pushes for closeness, the more the avoidant feels the need to escape. The more the avoidant escapes, the more the anxious person feels abandoned and tries to pull them back. It's like trying to hug someone who keeps stepping away from you. The harder you try, the more rejected you feel, and the more defensive and shut down they become. And yet both people often feel deeply attached, because this emotional chaos has created a bond. It's just not a healthy one. It's a bond based on fear, not safety, longing, not love. And yet, for many, that chaos is familiar. It mimics the way they felt in relationships from the past, relationships where love was inconsistent, conditional, or unpredictable. So when they experience that same pattern in adulthood, it doesn't raise alarms. It feels strangely comforting, like home. When two people come together in a relationship, there's always more happening beneath the surface than we realize. It's not just about chemistry, attraction, or shared interests. It's about the emotional roles we unconsciously step into. And one of the most powerful dynamics that plays out in many relationships, especially between an avoidant and an anxious partner, is this unspoken agreement to reinforce each other's deepest emotional wounds. Neither person is fully aware that it's happening, but the relationship becomes a stage for those old fears and insecurities to come to life. It's subtle at first. The anxious person starts by needing a bit more reassurance. Maybe they ask for more communication, more clarity, more closeness. The avoidant partner might initially meet those needs, but pretty quickly they begin to feel overwhelmed. The more the anxious partner seeks comfort and connection, the more the avoidant feels the need to protect themselves by creating emotional distance. This isn't because the avoidant doesn't care. It's because deep down the experience of intimacy brings up feelings they haven't resolved. Maybe they've learned somewhere along the way that closeness means loss of control, or that depending on someone opens the door to being hurt. So they've developed this instinct to step back the moment things get too emotionally intense. Meanwhile, the anxious partner is triggered by that very distance. It plays directly into their core fear of being abandoned or not being enough. They interpret the emotional withdrawal not as self-protection on the avoidance part, but as a sign that they're doing something wrong or that they're not lovable. So they start to overcompensate. They try to be more supportive, more patient, more loving. But underneath it all, what's really happening is fear. They're afraid of losing the connection, so they go into overdrive trying to preserve it. This starts a cycle. The avoidant begins to feel pressure, not because the anxious person is doing anything wrong, but because the avoidant interprets that emotional intensity as a threat to their autonomy. They feel like they're being asked to give something they don't know how to give without losing themselves in the process, so they retreat further. And this act of retreating confirms to the anxious person that they were right to be afraid. It confirms the idea that love is fragile, that it can disappear at any moment, and that if they're not constantly proving their worth, they'll be left behind. What makes this dynamic so toxic is that each person is playing out the very script that keeps them stuck. The avoidant gets to maintain their emotional independence and avoid vulnerability, while the anxious partner gets stuck chasing someone who will never fully give them the security they're craving. It's not even about who's right or wrong. It's about the way both people are using the relationship to validate their unconscious beliefs. The avoidant avoids emotional dependence because somewhere inside they've linked vulnerability to pain. The anxious person clings to love because they've learned that love is something you fight for, not something you receive freely. In this dance, both people are trying to soothe something within themselves, but they're doing it in ways that clash with each other. The anxious partner believes that closeness equals safety. The avoidant partner believes that distance equals safety. So every time the anxious person reaches out, the avoidant feels unsafe. And every time the avoidant pulls away, the anxious person feels unsafe. This is why the dynamic is so hard to break. It's not just about habits, it's about identity. The avoidant feels powerful when they're in control of their emotions and not relying on anyone else. That sense of control becomes their shield. The anxious person feels valuable when they're needed, when they're fixing, when they're giving their all. That act of giving becomes their strategy to avoid rejection. What neither person realizes is that this pattern is incredibly self-reinforcing. The avoidant keeps finding reasons to stay distant, and the anxious partner keeps trying to bridge the gap. And with every cycle, they dig deeper into their roles. The anxious partner becomes more desperate to hold on to the connection, even when it's unhealthy. The avoidant becomes more convinced that closeness always leads to pressure, demands, and emotional overwhelm. And the tragedy is that, in many cases, both people actually want connection. But the way they've learned to go about getting it creates conflict instead of closeness. The anxious partner might not understand that their pursuit feels invasive to the avoidant. And the avoidant might not understand that their distance feels like abandonment to the anxious partner. Each is trying to protect themselves in the only way they know how. But in doing so, they end up hurting each other in the exact way that triggers their deepest insecurities. When someone constantly pulls away from us or gives us just enough attention to keep us hooked but never fully shows up, something strange happens inside our minds. Instead of walking away or protecting ourselves, we often feel the opposite urge. We chase them. We try harder. We invest more. We become fixated on earning their love. And for someone with an anxious attachment style, this chase doesn't feel irrational. It feels like the most logical thing in the world. When love feels out of reach, the mind doesn't say, "This person can't meet my needs." It says, "There must be something wrong with me," or "If I try harder, maybe they'll finally see my worth." That's the trap. Anxious people are often hyper-attuned to signs of emotional distance. A slow reply, a shift in tone, a missed call. These things aren't just annoying, they're emotionally destabilizing. They create this internal alarm that says, something's wrong. But instead of looking at the other person and questioning their ability to show up emotionally, the anxious person looks inward and assumes blame. They start rewriting the narrative in their mind. Maybe I was too much. Maybe I should have said less. Maybe I need to be more chill, more patient, more understanding. And so begins the pursuit. It's not about love anymore. It's about survival. It's about trying to fix the discomfort inside by proving that they are in fact worthy of connection. What's especially dangerous is that the very thing that should be a red flag, emotional unavailability, gets mistaken for a challenge. When someone is distant or inconsistent, it triggers a belief that love is something that has to be earned, that love is scarce, that if they can just say the right thing, do the right thing, give enough, be enough, then maybe they'll finally unlock that person's affection. That's not connection. That's self-abandonment disguised as loyalty. But when you've grown up in an environment where love felt inconsistent or conditional, this pattern feels normal. It feels like home. There's a subtle emotional high that comes with trying to win over someone who isn't fully available. It feels like a mission, and with every tiny reward, a text back, a compliment, a small gesture of affection, you feel validated, like you're making progress. But that progress is fleeting, because the person you're chasing isn't actually becoming more emotionally available. They're just giving enough to reset the cycle. You don't realize you're being emotionally starved. You've just learned to celebrate crumbs. And when you're anxious, those crumbs feel like confirmation that you're not being crazy, that your efforts are paying off, that love is just around the corner if you keep holding on a little longer. This mindset keeps people stuck in emotionally unavailable relationships for far too long. And ironically, the more inconsistent the partner is, the more invested the anxious person becomes. Because now it's not just about love. It's about proving something to themselves, proving they're lovable, proving they can finally be chosen, proving that if they just hold on long enough, the person who keeps pulling away will eventually come around. But that goalpost keeps moving. Every time they think they've reached a breakthrough, it slips away again. And they interpret that as, I need to try even harder. It's exhausting, but it feels like the only way to make the relationship work. What's often missed in this cycle is the emotional toll it takes, the constant second-guessing, the over-analyzing of every text and conversation, the sleepless nights spent replaying what went wrong, the sense of walking on eggshells, trying not to say or do the thing that will make the other person pull away again. It's a slow erosion of self-esteem. And all the while, the anxious person is telling themselves they're being loyal, patient, and understanding, when in reality, they're compromising their own emotional needs in the hope that someone else will eventually rise to meet them. But emotional availability isn't something you chase. It's something someone either brings to the table or they don't. And when someone is pulling away, withholding affection, or giving you just enough to keep you hoping but never enough to make you feel secure, that's not love. That's a dynamic that feeds insecurity, reinforces low self-worth, and keeps people stuck in cycles of emotional dependence. Yet the anxious person rarely sees it that way. They think, if I give more, love harder, be better, then maybe the person will finally choose them fully. And that hope becomes addictive because every small sign of affection feels like it's getting closer to the breakthrough. Every time the avoidant partner comes back around, it reignites that hope that love is possible, that they're winning, that they're finally being seen. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, intimacy can feel like stepping into a space where they lose control. Vulnerability isn't comfortable, it's risky. It opens the door to being seen, to being known, and ultimately to being hurt. So rather than lean in, they create distance. They become masters of keeping people at arm's length. And what they often gravitate toward, without realizing it, is intensity. Not deep connection, not true emotional closeness, but drama, unpredictability, highs and lows that feel like a roller coaster. Because in the chaos of that emotional turbulence, they don't have to sit still long enough to actually connect. They can stay distracted, caught up in the storm of reactive emotions, never truly present in the calm of real intimacy. That's why avoidants often mistake intensity for intimacy. When someone shows up with a calm, stable kind of love, it can feel foreign, sometimes even boring. It doesn't activate their defenses in the same way, and that can be unnerving. But when they're with someone who is anxiously attached, someone who's constantly needing reassurance, constantly reaching, constantly trying to get closer, it creates a dynamic that's familiar. The avoidant gets to stay in their role. The one who withholds, the one who controls the pace, the one who decides how much emotional exposure is acceptable. And within that role, they feel safer. Not because it's healthy, but because it protects them from the very thing they're most afraid of, being emotionally overwhelmed or engulfed. The anxious partner brings all the emotional expression to the relationship. They ask the hard questions, they seek clarity, they initiate repair after conflict. And to the avoidant, this can feel like pressure, like intrusion. But at the same time, it gives the avoidant a sense of importance. They become the one being pursued, the one being needed. And even if they don't reciprocate that emotional intensity, being on the receiving end of it gives them a sense of power. It confirms their belief that they can maintain emotional distance and still be wanted. They don't have to change. They don't have to open up. They can stay behind the walls they've built, and someone else will do all the work of maintaining the relationship. That emotional intensity creates a push-pull cycle that becomes addictive. The avoidant doesn't want to be too close, but they also don't want to be alone. So they pull away until the anxious partner reaches out. When they do, the avoidant feels desired again. They allow just enough closeness to feel connected, but not enough to feel exposed. And then, once the emotional stakes rise again, they withdraw. It's a pattern they may not even see as unhealthy. To them, it's just how they've always managed emotional intimacy, by regulating it through distance. But what they're really doing is using intensity as a substitute for vulnerability. They're engaging in emotionally charged moments without ever truly letting someone in. In many cases, they've never experienced a version of love that felt safe and steady. So when they meet someone who triggers their attachment defenses, someone who wants more from them emotionally, it activates all the old programming. The emotional pushback they give isn't about the person in front of them. It's about everything they've learned to associate with closeness. Maybe they grew up in a home where emotions were unpredictable or overwhelming. Maybe they had to be self-sufficient too early. Whatever the origin, they carry a belief that emotional dependency is dangerous. So when someone starts to need them emotionally, their instinct is to pull away, to shut down, to avoid. But that doesn't mean they don't feel. It doesn't mean they don't care. It just means that caring deeply feels unsafe. And so they gravitate toward relationships that allow them to care in a controlled way. With anxious partners, they can dip in and out of emotional availability. They can be present one moment and distant the next, knowing that the anxious person will likely still be there, still reaching, still trying to reconnect. It creates a dynamic that avoids emotional accountability. The avoidant partner doesn't have to confront their own discomfort because the anxious partner keeps the emotional narrative alive. The emotional highs and lows create just enough stimulation to feel like something meaningful is happening, even when true intimacy is absent. Over time, this cycle becomes normalized. The avoidant may even come to believe that this is just how love works: highs, lows, intensity, confusion. They start to confuse emotional turbulence with emotional depth. They believe that if a relationship is calm and steady, it must be lacking passion, and so they continue choosing emotionally chaotic relationships, thinking they're pursuing love when they're actually avoiding vulnerability. They keep seeking that spark, that emotional charge, believing it's a sign of connection when it's really a symptom of unresolved emotional defenses. When avoidant and anxious individuals come together, they don't just bring their attachment styles into the relationship, they bring their entire emotional history. And one of the deepest, most damaging things that happens in this dynamic is that both people end up reinforcing the worst beliefs they already hold about themselves. It's not just a bad match, it becomes a mirror reflecting their biggest insecurities back at them. The anxious partner often carries the belief that they are not enough, that love is always slipping away, that if they don't constantly work to maintain connection, they'll be abandoned. And when they're paired with someone who is emotionally distant or inconsistent, that belief gets validated over and over again. Every time the avoidant partner withdraws or goes silent, it confirms the anxious person's fear that they are too much, too needy, or somehow unworthy of lasting affection. And instead of walking away, they try harder. They give more. They pour their energy into proving they're worth staying for. At the same time, the avoidant partner is often operating from the belief that closeness leads to pain, loss of self, or emotional chaos. Maybe they've been in situations where trusting someone led to betrayal. Maybe they never learned that emotional dependence can coexist with safety. So when they experience someone needing them emotionally, it doesn't register as love, it registers as a threat to their autonomy. And every time the anxious partner gets triggered and becomes more emotionally expressive or demanding, the avoidance fear of being consumed kicks in. They pull away, shut down, create space. Not because they're trying to hurt the other person, but because their nervous system interprets emotional closeness as danger. But that very retreat only makes the anxious partner more anxious. And so both people become locked in this painful feedback loop, where each person's coping strategy intensifies the other's fear. The anxious person becomes convinced that love requires constant effort. They believe they have to earn attention, affection, and consistency. So they stay, they overextend, they compromise their boundaries. And the more they do, the more exhausted and resentful they become. Deep down, they may not even realize they're abandoning their own needs in the process. They just know that the emotional withdrawal of their partner feels like a reflection of their own inadequacy. The avoidant partner, meanwhile, sees the anxiety, the intensity, the emotional neediness, and starts to believe that relationships are inherently overwhelming, that emotional demands are always too much, that the only way to feel safe is to stay independent. And so they harden. They learn not to trust emotional vulnerability, and they shut out opportunities for real connection, even when a part of them deeply craves it. This is where the real damage happens. Over time, both people stop seeing the other as someone to connect with and start seeing them as the source of their pain. The anxious person begins to resent the avoidant for being emotionally unavailable. The avoidant begins to resent the anxious partner for always pushing for more than they can give. But at the same time, both are deeply entangled because this emotional dynamic, however painful, feels familiar. It replicates patterns they've known for years, and the familiarity keeps them hooked, even when the relationship is no longer healthy. They may not even realize that they're not fighting for love. They're fighting to resolve old wounds, to rewrite emotional narratives that were never healed. But in the process, they lose sight of what love is supposed to feel like. It's supposed to feel safe. It's supposed to feel supportive. It's supposed to feel reciprocal. But when you're stuck in the avoidant anxious loop, love feels like anxiety, like longing, like emotional starvation. What's especially heartbreaking is how both people often see the worst version of themselves in this dynamic. The anxious partner may start off strong, self-aware, confident, but months into the relationship, they barely recognize themselves. They're anxious all the time, constantly checking their phone, questioning their worth, feeling like they're chasing something they can never quite reach. The avoidant partner may start out generous, charming, affectionate, but over time they become distant, cold, avoidant of any emotional confrontation. They begin to feel suffocated even when nothing's being asked of them. Both people are reacting to their own pain, but because they don't know how to meet in the middle, they keep triggering each other. And neither of them is truly wrong. They're just trying to get their needs met the only way they know how, but those methods clash. The anxious person reaches out when they feel unsafe, but the avoidant person pulls away when things get too emotionally charged. The more one tries to connect, the more the other disconnects. And the longer this goes on, the more damage it does. It becomes less about the relationship and more about survival. One person is trying to hold it together, while the other is trying to hold on to themselves. And the tragedy is, both think they're doing what's necessary to protect their hearts, but in reality, they're slowly breaking each other's.